Hello, everyone. My name is Frank Finley. I'm the Executive Director of MASB. I'd like to welcome you to our newest installment of our Making Marketing Accountable webinar series. We have a wonderful presentation for you today on understanding your blueprint for brand growth. I am very happy today to have with us not one, not two, but three speakers. So all three speakers are extremely talented marketing analytic experts from Kantar, and they will be giving us both an overview of their new blueprint for brand growth and also providing a deeper dive into its empirical underpinnings. So please welcome from Kantar, Marc Glovsky, Senior Brand Strategist, Jorge Alagon, Global Head of Data Science Innovations, and Graham Staplehurst, Global Thought Leadership Director. So gentlemen, the podium is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Frank. Thank you and welcome. And thank you to the Marketing Accountability Standards Board for this great opportunity. As Frank said, my name is Marc Glovsky. I'm a senior brand strategist at Kantar based in the US. And as he mentioned, I'm here with Jorge Alagon, and who's a senior director in our global analytics practice, and Graham, who's a senior thought leader in our BrandZ space practice. Today, we're going to be talking about Blueprint for Brand Growth, which is an evidence-based framework that helps marketers focus on the key drivers and barriers of brand growth in a complex environment that we're all in. The framework's based on extensive research we've conducted across a wide array of categories, markets, brands, and time, using attitudinal behavioral data at scale. We'll present for approximately 40 minutes, give or take. We're going to leave that 15 minutes, as Frank mentioned, for a live Q&A at the end. So next slide, please. And here's what we're going to cover today. First, I'm going to introduce you to what the blueprint is. It's an extensive work that's been done to the extensive work that's been done to derive it. The core principles that underpin it. There's a primary growth driver and 3 growth accelerators that we're going to talk about, and the implications for CMOs and brands who look to leverage it. Jorge and Graham are then going to present the key evidence that supports Blueprint's growth principles, that emphasizes the need to have more of something beyond the size of your brand to deliver competitively superior growth. Then again, we're going to wrap up with some Q&A. All right, so what is the blueprint? Well, let's start by defining what we're looking to explain with a blueprint. And that is how brands, as malleable assets that companies curate and steward, help those firms capture more than their fair share of a given market's available revenue and profit, irrespective of the market conditions. This growth matters to the brand's chief stakeholders. That's both owners of the brands as well as investors who want to see a return on their investment. For the first time, Kantar has conducted a meta-analysis of the world's largest attitudinal database about what people think and feel about brands from our BrandZ database, with the largest behavioral database about what people actually buy from Kantar World Panel, all using our IP, the Meaningfully Different and Salient framework. Specifically, we took 5.4 billion attitudinal data points for over 20,000 brands in hundreds of categories across 54 markets, and 1.1 billion purchase data points for over 20,000 brands in 100 categories across 25 markets. In addition, we utilize various other data assets, including our World Panel Comtech, usage panels, as well as Brand Dynamics, which provides us with daily brand signals, and our extensive normative databases from our link and lift work in the creative and media spaces, as well as incorporating publicly available sources to enrich our analyses even further. And our analysis techniques varied widely, employing everything from AI and machine learning to multivariate and time series analysis, tailored to the specific data and research questions at hand. And our data scientists and other Kantar experts analyze the results. This comprehensive approach allowed us to analyze every category and sector imaginable, from fast-moving consumer goods to longer-term purchases to services and even B2B markets. Most importantly, these analyses were longitudinal in nature, over a period of 10 years, in fact. And this enabled us ultimately to deduce what drives true sustainable business growth. And we spent all of that time and Mark Twain the learning from our analyses to write a short, concise set of to distill it down to a set of short, concise growth principles that we call the blueprint for brand growth. And here it is. First and foremost, to drive share, you need to attract more people to build penetration. That's pretty simple. But how do you attract more people? Well, by being meaningfully different to more people. Being meaningfully different to more people increases the probability of future growth and allows you to charge and maintain a price premium. So being meaningfully different to more people is a growth driver. It's your strategic growth driver. CMOs can leverage and can operationalize this strategic growth driver via 3 accelerators, which are interconnected. Firstly, predispose more people. What does that mean? That means increasing your probability of purchase by strengthening the predisposition everyone in a given market has towards your brand through their exposures to it and experience of it. This is about being salient and relevant in key decision moments. Secondly, it's about being more present. What does that mean? That means maximizing the conversion of the predisposition you've built towards your brand, as well as capturing choices from those predisposed to other brands by optimizing marketing investment in the customer journey, your distribution, your range, your pack, your pricing, and activation. And last but certainly not least is about finding new space as another accelerator. Future growth can't be left to chance. Depending on the category and brand maturity that your brand sits in, redefining the business that you're in so you can optimally stretch into new motivations, occasions, categories, and services so that you can keep growing. Next slide, please. So let's dive a little further into each of these growth principles. To drive penetration, you need more people. We found that the best correlate with higher penetration was how meaningfully different your brand is. These measures identify stronger functional and emotively meaningful connections in areas of perceived relative difference. So why do we put this first? Well, we found that if you have high meaningful difference, 5 times as many people will buy you in a given time period versus those brands that are least meaningfully different. Even more importantly, it gives you a better chance of significant future penetration growth, which we define as more than 1.2%. Graham's going to get a bit more into the evidence in a moment. So driving penetration is not just a numbers game. People's attitudes toward your brand matter. Category context and brand size are key starting points, and using this framework can help you identify who you want to serve, what their needs are, and how many people you need to recruit to reach your growth ambition. To be meaningful to more people that you've identified, a brand should be designed to meet the needs that matter most to those people. This could mean embracing a range of consumer needs in the physical, emotional, functional, and social realms, as well as other ways that brands work in consumers' minds and lives. And there's no one way to be relatively different. This can be achieved in many ways, via product superiority, ownable distinctive assets, demonstrated category leadership, or just being seen as a unique expression within the category. So, what do CMOs need to consider if they want to be meaningfully different to more people and embrace this strategic growth driver? Well, first, factor difference into your brand positioning and strategy. It is the fundamental reason that brands have value for business and means brands are strong and resilient. 2, use meaningful difference to convince your board to invest in brand. Brands with higher meaningful difference have many financial advantages over competitors. They justify brand choice and the price paid. They mitigate the risk of substitutability. This ensures that they're well connected to many usage occasions, which increases the likelihood of future penetration growth. Third, measure and optimize your sources and degrees of difference. This is about maintaining a consistent relative edge over alternatives within the category you operate in. 4, have a distinctive view of difference and distinctiveness. A holistic view rather. They are 2 sides of the same coin. Physical points of distinctiveness trigger mental associations of how the brand differs from competitors. And 5th, and finally, think strategically. There are many routes to creating differentiation, and you should explore all of them, individually and in combination, to be as effective as possible. And you can very simply operationalize the blueprint using what we call starting grids. There's a very specific starting grid for each of the growth driver and the 3 growth accelerators, which I'll get into a bit more in a moment. The purpose of a starting grid is to help build an understanding of the next big questions you should be asking. For the be meaningfully different to more people strategic growth driver we just discussed, we map a brand's meaningfulness against their relative difference to determine if we need to further explore the meaning or the difference of the brand. Brands that are different but lack meaning need to break through that growth ceiling by broadening the scale of their appeal and avoiding becoming too niche or specialist. Conversely, brands that are meaningful but lack difference need to find ways to stand apart. It's likely that today they're successful in meeting broad category needs, but stronger predisposition can be built by cultivating perceived relative difference on the things that matter. This will help insulate against the continual threat of disruption in the category. Graham's going to show you some more examples of starting grids in practice shortly, but do know that if you score highly on both of these metrics, we would encourage your organization to apply their focus to the 3 growth accelerators. First, predispose more people as the first growth accelerator. You need to increase the probability of purchase by strengthening the predisposition everyone has towards your brand. This requires you to invest in exposures and experiences that make your brand mentally available and meaningfully different to more people. Kantar data shows that brands that people are strongly predisposed to have 9 times higher volume share, command twice the price, and have 4 times the likelihood of value share growth than brands with weaker predisposition. Predisposition should not be misconstrued as loyalty. Lots of data sources are out there, including our own, that show that loyalty doesn't really exist. However, Kantar data does show that you can stack the odds in your favor to give people a positive bias that gives your brand a head start. That's predisposition. And there are 2 types of predisposition. There's predisposing more people to buy you, and there's also predisposing a person to pay more for you than alternatives in the category. Think about your own buying behavior. There's some brands you consider and others that you don't, and you don't always buy the cheapest brand in the category. The way brands build predisposition is through all the interactions and touch points that they have with consumers. These interactions can be summarized as exposures and experiences. So invest in your brand. Value high quality creative that's consistent over time and allocate your media effectively across your markets and categories. Assess effectiveness across touch points for both shorter and long-term objectives. Also, your pricing strategy needs to capture the full value of your equity. Promotions can destroy value, so you use with caution to drive trial and volume expansion only when needed. Instead, use pricing architecture to create the right choices for your consumers. And last but not least, experience is an underutilized predisposition builder. Meaningfully different experiences, which are aligned to a clear brand positioning, create consistency and connectivity that helps reduce churn and accelerate acquisition. Next, be more present. Be more present is all about optimizing your marketing investment in distribution, product range, pack, pricing, promotions, and the other activities that ensure that you have the right availability and visibility to convert all that predisposition that you've built and capture choices from other brands. It's more than just bottom of funnel or physical availability. In fact, we found that brands that are always present attract 7 times more buyers compared to those present on just 1/2 of buying occasions. And there's always room for improvement. In fact, only 5% of brands have a category presence of over 80%. And being more present can come in many forms, from the streaming service that benefits from being on top of your menu list, your phone's home screen, and as a prominent button on your new TV remote, the bank that offers service hours that fit your needs, the distribution, shelf space, and optimal range for your daily food and beverage choices. And all at the right price that can be justified by your brand associations. As the landscape becomes ever more diverse, it's increasingly critical for brands to be present where the choices are being made. Big brands grow by offering more choices than their closest rivals. The right range is an essential component of their presence. Additional SKUs and varieties will help reach different buyers and occasions. It also helps them to stand out. Smaller brands usually gain more from focusing on availability of the existing range. And irrespective of brand size, your brand needs to trigger the right mental associations that connect the buyer to their predisposition toward your brand. So strong, distinctive brand assets aid in that endeavor. Finally, make it easy to complete the sale by removing as much friction points in all channels as possible. Manage your transactional customer experience, online or offline, across the whole purchase cycle, so you can anticipate and predict consumer needs, preventing your customers from spending with your competitors. And finding new space. Our third growth accelerator is all about finding incrementality, the motivations, the occasions, the categories, the services for your brand to stretch into. Win in these new spaces through meaningfully different innovation, expanded distribution, and communications. We found that brands that stretch into more incremental usage or consumption occasions have double the chance of growth versus those that don't. In fact, stretching a brand to cover 10% more of a category's available needs and consumption moments leads to over 17% brand growth. Think of travel apps offering bookings of on-location experiences, or easy access to mobility solutions, or garden centers offering services around plant care for those without green fingers, or a beer brand that offers non-alcoholic and low-carb options, or a digital taxi service that expands into grocery delivery. Challenge the definition of the category you're in. Most category definitions are product-based, meaning brands fail to understand the emerging needs and occasions you could serve and are unaware of alternate solutions people use to satisfy their needs today. Knowing which demand moments exist and their anticipated future growth will help you find new space. So understand category context to see if new space really is the best growth opportunity for your brand. Immature categories allow your brand to benefit from category penetration increases and the development of new habits, while mature categories have reached their potential and habits are fully formed. So leading brands have to find new space to maintain growth. Your brand size today determines where you can most easily find new space. Those smaller brands need to disrupt default buying behaviors in order to steal existing buyers from bigger brands and bigger competitors. In fact, our shopper data shows that smaller brands get about 80% of their incremental growth through this stealing of existing buyers. Conversely, bigger brands only get about 10% of their sales that way and are much more reliant on existing buyers buying more frequently and getting new people to shop the category altogether. So for them, bigger brands' growth necessitates breaking boundaries, pushing the definition of the category, spotting the peripheral and future needs, and stepping up to address them. This is the blueprint for brand growth. I'm now going to hand it over to Graham and Jorge to walk us through even more of the evidence behind the framework. Graham?
Thank you, Marc. Well, Marc has presented you with a lot of facts to support the statements and metrics that we've built into the blueprint for brand growth. Jorge and I are here to explain a little bit more about how we arrived at these facts and the evidence behind them. Now, Marc's already mentioned how we took our data from a wide variety of internal sources, our BrandZ global brand equity studies that are based on a wide range of attitudinal measures, our World Panel consumer behavior data that covers actual purchases and consumption, and more. All our analysis has been about matching up attitudes and behavior for the same brands. In some cases, we're fortunate to have single source data where we can survey the attitudes of individual consumers and also observe their behavior afterwards. In other cases, we've matched the data sets for the relevant time periods. Now, we can't show you everything that we found less useful or unhelpful in this short presentation, but we will try to illustrate how we've arrived at our key conclusions through analysis. And at the heart of the blueprint for brand growth that Marc has described is the meaningful, different, and salient framework that was developed by Kantar from work in 2011 to 2012 across hundreds of brands. And we used a reanalysis of existing survey data and a whole heap of experimentation and piloting, and it's certified by MASB's Marketing Metric Accountability Protocol. Now, there are 3 elements to the framework empirically derived through an exploratory and rigorous R&D process to understand which brand associations drove behavior. The blueprint emphasizes meaningful and different first, the orange and blue segments here, because they're the foundations of your brand perceptions. They are what exists in the consumer's minds. Salience is there to amplify, extend, to remind consumers and ensure that those perceptions are readily available in mind at the point where a brand choice has to be made, the intersection of these 3 elements. And that can be with or without significant conscious mental effort. So how did we get to those things? Well, we used 5 survey questions as inputs to create 3 orthogonal factors: meaningful, different, and salient. The maths behind this ensures that each factor describes its own quality of those brand perceptions with as little overlap as possible. And what's most important is the context. Every question that we ask is relative to competing brands in the categories. So we present people with the brands that they would have as choices, and we ask them to rate or rank each of the brands on these attributes in turn. Because this model is all about those choices, it's trying to explain and describe why people choose one brand over another. Now, putting those meaningful, different, and salient metrics together gives us 4 powerful value-based metrics. All these different forms of value are connected, and the value can flow from one aspect to another. If I start on the left, demand power, that's a measure of consumer demand for the brand, which gives us a prediction of the brand's volume share based purely on perceptions. It correlates with market share, although it doesn't have activation factors built into it. Pricing power at the top is the ability of the brand to justify a price premium relative to the category average, again, based purely on those perceptions. So on average, brands with higher pricing power can charge more, as we'll soon come to. Activation power on the right is the strength of the brand at converting that predisposition into actual choices. Because brands not only need to be easy to mind, they need to be easy to find. And the right connections between the brand's mental associations and the context when consumers are making decisions, those things Marc talked about, price, availability, appearance, and so on, ensure a positive flow of value to the brand. And future power at the bottom is the probability that the brand will grow its value share in the next 12 months based on current perceptions. And brands with high future power are, of course, more likely to grow than low future power brands. So here's an example of one of these. I'm going to show you an example for Walmart. So Walmart's demand power index, I'm getting a time lag on this. I'm hoping that, here we go. Right. Walmart's demand power index of 289 means it should command about 3 times, or 300 index points, the market share in grocery of the average US chain. And it's driven by being meaningful, different, and salient. But the importance of each component in creating demand power will vary across categories and in each country. Here we can see the proportionate impact of each factor. Meaningful contributing 35%, difference 15%, and salience the remaining 50%. But in another country, we'd see that the impact on growing your demand power will vary. Finally, the last set of bars shows Walmart's performance as an index relative to the average brand in the category. And we can see how strong it is on the most important dimension here of salience, because you can hardly go down a town centre or a shopping centre in the US without encountering a Walmart. And now over to Jorge.
Hi. So I'm going to get a little bit deeper on the data that, or on the evidence that supports the blueprint. So the first slide that I'm going to show you, it talks about the 5x that we mentioned earlier. For this, we were able to match 1,602 brands in a lot of projects in categories and basically in a good cross-section of countries across the world. And these include, from FMCGs to services to long-term purchases. And when we analyze these behavior and perceptual data, and we group those brands that have high demand power at the top tertile and compare that to low demand power, in the bottom tertile, so in the bottom 33% versus the top 33%, we see at this 5x where it's coming from. So we see that brands with high demand power capture 15 points of penetration on average, versus those that have only low demand power, they only have 3%. So that's the 5x where it's coming from, right? So this is just a quick proof of how equity drives, or it's related to actual penetration. Going beyond these, we can also do the same thing, but with market share. So what you see here is the market share in terms of volume for those same tertiles. And you can see that in this case, the multiple is 9 times, right? So brands with higher meaningful difference and salience with high demand power capture a lot more volume share today. So as all of this is related to choosing the brand, but the other aspect is, does your brand sustain a price, the price that you're wanting to pay, or do you want it to charge for? So what we are showing here is how much people, when we group them into tertiles of pricing power, relates to the actual price paid by those for those brands in the market. And the multiple is twice, right? So those brands who have high pricing power can charge double the price of those brands with low pricing power. And this is coming from the same number of brands and studies in the world, right? So this is the other route to grow, right? It's not just about volume, it's about charging the right price for your product. And beyond that, this is one of those evidence points that we're collecting, or that we have collected very recently. And this is a case study, right? For which this is an FMCG brand, where we are comparing the actual price elasticity modeled by market mix models to the pricing power of those brands. And here we have 6 brands, and this is an average over more than 10 markets, right? And what you can see is when a brand has higher pricing power, it has lower price elasticity, right? And this is very important for your margins, right? Because if you can charge a higher price without losing that many consumers, then you can potentially increase your revenue and your profitability, right? So this is a very important route for growth that sometimes is overlooked by other approaches on how marketing works, right? So beyond the metrics that we've shown that simply or mostly describe the brand's current market share or penetration or price paid, we need to go beyond that and see what actually drives growth, right? So what is driving that? And for that, we need to embrace deviations from the expected value. So which brands are bucking the trend? Those that have more of something than their brand size would suggest. And handing over to Graham now.
So this analysis is based on over 14,000 cases from the Kantar BrandZ database that I helped to manage. And what we did was that we identified from across all the different metrics that we have available to us, the ones that best matched a behavioral measure of share. And the behavioral measure of share turned out to be a very simple question. We just asked people, which brand did you buy or choose or use last time? So we get a single answer out of that, and we get a percentage share. And we look to see whether for cases where we had the brand measured in year naught and then 2 years afterwards, so across a whole time period from 2014 up to the present day, we look to see the same brand, same category, same market, which brands grew on that metric of choice, so the last usage, and which brands declined on that. And we found that the most discriminating metric, the best predictor, was the brand equity measure relative to the expected level for a brand of that size. So what I'm showing you here is the relative strength or the deviation of the brand's equity at the starting point. And we're looking to see which of our metrics had more or less in the growing group of brands compared to the declining group of brands. And in fact, what we found was really very, very clear. The brands that grew tended to have a significant advantage on being more different than expected. The brands that declined actually had more salience. And you know, that really was quite a staggering point to us, because we assumed that salience would have just as much impact, but actually we found growth was being driven most often by being different. Now, got an example of that for you here. If we go on and we look at TikTok. So we all know how much that TikTok has grown in recent years. It's a phenomenal brand, and it's gained momentum primarily by delivering a great different experience. Look, even back in 2020 here, it was well over the average for being different. And if you compare its different score here with 2023, it sustains that difference, but it gains a meaningful and salient connection with more and more and more consumers. So like Marc said, you want to be meaningfully different to more people. It's exactly what TikTok has been able to do. And it's delivered that through the brand experience. Now let's look at, we'll look at now very quickly a tale of two Mexican-themed fast food chains in Australia. Guzman y Gomez had the advantage over Zambrero in that extra difference. Look, 114 compared to 100. And it grew at a much faster rate. It over-indexed on difference, and it benefited as a result. The meaningful and salient scores for the two brands are very similar. It's the difference that makes the difference. In June 2024, they were the best IPO in Australia for the last 3 years. And actually, they're planning to match the number of McDonald's stores in Australia, albeit over the next 20 years. I'm going to stay in Australia for my next example, because what about these two beers? We have Castlemaine 4X on the left, and we have Great Northern Brewing Company on the right. They're both from Queensland. They're both a similar size in 2019 in terms of volume sold. In fact, 4X has a slight advantage. Who do you think is going to grow more over the next 5 years? Well, in fact, if we go on to the next chart, Jorge, we can see that advantage that Great Northern had in meaningful difference propelled a heady growth for it. And it's actually up 51% in volume terms, and 4X slowly declining. Deviations from expected values are insightful in all of our data. If we go on, we can see here the streaming market in the US, and obviously we're all very familiar with Amazon Prime, with Netflix, and the rest of the brands that have been crowding into the market in the last few years. We know that demand power and penetration are positively associated, but penetration isn't the only relevant metric. Brands need to retain customers as well as winning them. That's not just a function of penetration. In this case, we see Amazon Prime and Netflix have similar penetration, but very different levels of demand power. Does that mean that demand power doesn't work in this market? Well, no, because we see that actually the deviation to the right or to the left of this line relates exactly to the churn rate that these two streaming services have. In fact, Netflix has half the churn rate that Amazon Prime does. As more and more new entrants launched into the category, Prime is more easily substituted, or it's supported only because of its promotional connection to shopping. So the effect of difference is really important, and it's the effect of difference on pricing power, where typically, as the ring on the left shows, it's 49% of the weight when we calculate our pricing power metric that is supporting your margin and your margin growth. And actually, I just had a very simple exploration on the right hand side here. We saw earlier demand power had a high contribution from salience, not pricing power. Difference is what's important. We ask another question on our study: how much of each of these brands worth paying for? And the percent that the brand is worth paying for systemically increases as we look at brands from the lowest to the highest difference index. The higher the difference index, the more consumers agree that the brand is worth it. And we've had repeated bits of evidence here. Even a study in 2022 by Said Business School at the University of Oxford found that difference was the best brand metric to improve existing models of abnormal stock market returns. They looked at 328 US companies over about 10-year period, and they showed from throwing everything into their models, difference was the one brand equity metric that really helped to improve the prediction of which brand was going to beat the stock market. It can also be a negative indicator in the sense of it helps you to understand what's going wrong with your brand. And to do that, I'm illustrating it with Bed Bath & Beyond. Opened in 1971, and it's a superstore that became famous as a category killer in the US, but the company's decline was marked by a series of missteps, supply chain issues, poor management decisions, and finally an inability to compete on price with online retailers and discount stores. And we can see here pricing power declines were its biggest problem. It originally, if you go back 10 years, it had a +6 deviation, so it was a positive for it. Ends up in 2021, just a year or two before it files for bankruptcy, with a negative deviation. And we can see how it grew less meaningful, less different, and less salient over that period. In fact, I don't have the data from 2023 because it becomes so weak we didn't bother to measure it anymore after 2021. So we can see that if we had seen the data back in 2015, 16, 17, the weakening of that pricing power deviation, we would have been more worried about the future of this brand. Jorge, how can we look to the future?
Yes, so let's go on to predict the future prospects of a brand. Of course, there are many factors that are going to affect a brand's actual success or otherwise. For example, its rate of investment, competitive activity. Nothing in life is guaranteed, but we can look at the extra equity a brand has relative to its size, how much extra meaningfulness, difference, and salience, and combine that into a single score, which we call future power. brands with high future power have 4 times higher probability of gaining value share, so revenue share in the future, compared to brands with low future power. It is a massive notch in the right direction. This comes from another data source where we matched data sources, right? So in as mentioned before, we're not using a single database, we're using many different databases for which we had data. Now, this final data point here, well, next to final data point, comes from 14,000 brands that for which we matched actual data points 2 years apart, right? For which we had the equity measures plus the BODLAST, the surrogate of penetration in BrandZ. And what we learned from these across the world is that actually brand size is not the best predictor of penetration growth in the future. Actually, it has the opposite effect. So low brand size brands, so smaller brands, actually tend to increase penetration, right? Whereas big brands tend to decrease, right? So brand size is not the best predictor of actual growth. Yes, big brands will tend to be big 2 years apart, and small brands will tend to be small, still 2 years apart. But the movement is going into the center, and the dynamics are changing, right? So, what is it that predicts growth in penetration? So we're seeing that in the bottom there, the future power. Future power is a metric that we combine when we combine meaningful, different, and salient, and mostly it uses meaningful and difference, not so much salience. And what we see is, yes, this measure actually has a lot of predicting power of growth, as we saw in the previous slide, and how much of that growth is, so brands have a higher probability of growth, but also they tend to grow more. And when you amplify your meaningful difference during those 2 years, after the first measurement of your future power, and you work on your salience, on your being present, on extending into new spaces, what you see here is, after those 2 years, when you achieve that growth in salience, those brands that start with high future power grow faster, right, and have always an advantage, right? So what we're saying here is that the most important ingredient today to prime your brand for growth is being meaningfully different, right? And that's something that sometimes gets not so much stressed, and we think that we only need to work on mental availability. Yes, you do, but also you need to start from somewhere, and you need to retain that meaningful difference. Graham?
So, to conclude, we have taken a huge amount of data from multiple sources. We've looked at it over time, and we have analyzed it using the most sophisticated techniques that we can bring to bear on it. Today, we've shown you some of the simplest evidence because we want the evidence to be understandable by all. But it's not a theoretical model, it's a practical one. And as Marc showed, we've got practical tools to apply it and implement it day in, day out around the world. And that, to me, is the biggest bit of evidence that we have to support the blueprint for brand growth. It's been useful to Kantar and to Kantar's clients for the last 10 years and more. So if the meaningful, different, and salient framework didn't prove useful, we'd soon be out of business. But fortunately, we are still here today, and we're more than happy to share the blueprint with you all. So if you want to know more, there are 2 versions of the blueprint, an executive summary and a full book, which is, I can't remember now, but it's about 60 pages long, I think, which contains all the analysis, the meta-analysis, the crucial supporting data points, the narrative for each of them, and all of the detail that Marc went through, more for the strategic driver, is included also for each of the growth accelerators. So hop onto Kantar.com, search for Blueprint, and you'll be able to download that. But I'm sure you have more questions. I'm already seeing some come through, but I think I'm handing back to Frank to help to moderate a final Q&A with us.
Yes, well, thank you very much for that. I'd like to start one from Nick. He asks, did you identify any regional variations in the blueprint for growth?
Well, I'll go first on that one. And in simply put, I would say no. There are obviously strong regional variations in the mechanisms that you might use, in order to leverage the strength of your brand, or to remedy gaps in its brand equity and so on. So we know that, routes to market and so on might well be different in China or India than they would be in the UK or the US. But that doesn't change the fundamentals. We see that meaningfully different brands gain more brand choice, more penetration, more share in all markets around the world.
Okay. Yes. Beyond that, we've seen more variation between brands within a certain category on what they need to do than necessarily across regions.
Yeah, I wonder on the meaningfully different, I wonder how consistent it is across geography for brands. I don't know if you've ever looked into that to say, what is meaningfully different in region A may be different from region B, though they may both be strong. Have you ever looked at that aspect as to what drives the meaningfully different sentiments among the individuals for a brand?
Yeah, we have. I mean, the database we've got of BrandZ brands allows us to do that. And broadly speaking, it's actually having a great range of well-designed products and services that are convenient and easy to access, that drives brands in any sort of a category almost anywhere, right? So those are the fundamentals. Beyond that, yes, there are deviations, and for example, the degree to which the sustainability of a brand is positively perceived or not, that will vary from one market to another. But actually, everywhere, for the vast majority of brands, that's still at the moment a secondary factor. It might be a good way to differentiate your brand. But as Marc said earlier on, there are so many ways to differentiate a brand, and that will be down to your circumstances, what your brand can say, the competitors it's against and so on, rather than any particular cultural difference around the world.
Great.
Use the same that.
Sorry, Marc.
Real quick, Jorge. So, Frank, yes, to Graham's point, what's meaningfully different to consumers in various markets is different. But also, we'll even see that phenomenon within a given market. And I was using as an example within the chat earlier, Disney is it's a mega brand, and it operates and yields revenue and profit for itself across a multitude of different categories. And if you put yourself into that category context, which we always encourage doing, you'll see the brand show up in terms of its strength and what's meaningful and relevant to them differently in these different categories. When they operate in cruise ships, when they operate in streaming services, and when they operate in theme parks, those are a completely different set of needs. Now, the overall equities that the brand carries will translate across those, but also they have to help satiate the needs of that individual category buyer. Somebody who's looking to entertain in a streaming context is going to be very different than someone that's looking to have a travel experience. And the Disney brand needs to show up and be relevant and differentiate itself within the category, but differentiations might look a little different, and meaning will look a little different depending on what they're trying to do in each of those categories.
Yes, and I actually have a follow-up for that. I actually received a text message because some people have my phone and were texting me that way too. And it actually goes to what you were saying earlier, Marc. regarding new spaces, which we in a MASB term, we call those real options, the brand extensions, if you will. And the question that came up with, is there a way to test those using the meaningfully different framework? Like, how would you go about and test if an expansion, a new space was, as this person say, a good investment?
Well, yes, Kantar works with lots of our clients. I'll let Graham and Jorge talk about what was done in the R&D laboratory to sort of define new spaces and such. But we obviously there's innovation and finding new space. There's defining new space. Then there's developing solutions for those new spaces, and whether or not that's going to meet the needs of the consumer. And oftentimes we see companies struggle with the translate. They might find a dig site. They have a hard time sort of creating the solution so there's a multitude of things that need to happen in order to have an effective innovation. The first stage is just to identify, do you have the equity and the strength to innovate? And then do you need to stretch in order to find incremental growth? And then where are those spaces? That's sort of step two. So you innovate in the right places. And then third is having the right innovation to succeed and to satiate that set of needs that you've identified.
As you said, it can have a different name in different ways, but we chose the word space quite specifically because it's actually, you might not need to innovate the product at all. It's about identifying, and often this can come from observation. Oh, look, this group of consumers, they're using this product to do, this product to do something that we didn't expect them to do. Let's actually amplify that and tell everybody that, I don't know, you can use this for breakfast as well as for dinner, or you can use it in your car as well as in your lounge or whatever. It's like for a lot of small brands, finding new space means actually telling people how to use your product, and them not just assuming, oh, I used it this once, or this friend gave it to me on this occasion, that's what it's for. It's actually, no, it's much more than that. And that can be, particularly for small brands, as important, in fact often much better return on company investment than trying to invest in a new product that might need a new production line, a new tool, a new training for your service providers, whatever it is. That's a lot more of an investment to develop a new product or a new service than it is simply to take what you've got and use it and tell people how to use it in new and different ways.
Yeah, I very much resonate with that. I remember the Rice Krispie snack trend, if you remember, coming in. You talk about breakfast being cereal going into a different time period, and so that that's a leap that is sometimes hard to even see on that front, but when it happens, it's magic. So we have Joanna has asked a couple questions actually here. Instead of reading them, Joanna, do you just want to for me to unmute you and you can ask them directly?
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes.
First of all, Graham and Jorge, it is such a pleasure to see you. Marc, we don't have the same, past history. I don't think, but it's great to see you guys doing such, good things with the BrandZ data and really starting to leverage it. Mine is more of an idea because, and you can guess where I'm coming from, knowing what I and MASB specialize in, which is you started to do that in one of the Australian examples, which is where it suddenly became 3 times more powerful, which is when you showed the revenue growth that was achieved. I think you have the data in BrandZ from the valuation history, which goes back, if I remember rightly, to 2006. So you could show how much sales and margin growth, so both pricing power as well as, share and all the rest of it. Then you could present the actions you take as something to take to CFOs, CEOs, and boards and a way to get the right level of investment in brand and marketing and to get them to improve it. So that's what I would, one thing I would say. I would also be taking products into new spaces. I'll tell you a great example, which you may be familiar with, is EOS. Started out just being lip balm and then expanded into new categories. And one of them was shaving cream for men. And then they discovered from TikTok videos that women were using it to shave themselves, not just under their arms, but in other more private places, because they demonstrated this on TikTok. And so they completely changed their marketing and boosted their sales without changing the product one iota. Yeah.
Exactly. And I'm sure there are many, many more examples of that. Jorge.
No, I think that you're going to mention the work we're doing with Said Business School, right?
Yeah. So the first thing is, yes, as I mentioned very briefly, we didn't have the time to show any of it, but yeah, we're looking at showing a connection between brand and company results through work with Said Business School. But look, we've actually tried a lot of things. So we have the connection between brand equity and brand as an asset. So in fact, this year, we showed that brands as assets for the top 100 brands in the world have now risen to be represent 32% of company value. So 32% on average across all the brands, from Apple to Coke to HSBC, I think was the bottom of the ranking. All of those brands, if you look at them on average, 32% of their company value lies in the brand. So if that isn't in itself, enough of a motivator.
Yeah, well,
of course,
I can see that. You can see that from some of the data, which is great.
Now,
even
I
better,
would love
you
to,
can show what it is for brands that aren't in the top 100 and how that compares.
Well, yes, that would be another, absolutely a good comparator to have, and to have it for a variety. And of course, we have it for hundreds of brands around the world, because we also value brands in 15 different countries. Obviously, individually, we do top 30 or 50 or 75 in lots of places around the world now. But look, I've also tried in the last couple of years looking at, is there a direct correlation between our meaningful, different and salient metrics and company profitability? Now, that is a hell of a lot harder to directly establish. I have to say, it took us 18 months anyway to get all of the blueprint for brand growth, all those analytics that Jorge and I took you through. It took 18 months. And the biggest problem is just matching up the data sets, and this is a real challenge for us all the time. However, yes, our initial attempt to connect directly to profitability found it. And then we've realized it's because, of course, the relative profitability of oil and gas companies against investment banks against a CPG business is completely different. So what we have to do is to actually now start drilling down and look at relative profitability in each sector and show how our brand equity metrics connect to that. So yes, it's all stuff that we're working on. And I think in the end, even that wouldn't necessarily convince a board. What we need to do, of course, is develop that unified model for a given brand to show how investment relates to brand equity, how brand equity relates to profit, how profit then obviously will drive their business value overall. That would be great, but typically you're only going to be able to do that on an individual brand basis, and that sort of project typically doesn't get publicized because it's very private and specific to the business. So we may struggle to have it on a big basis, but yes, we are putting together, in answer to your other question, we're putting together an extra 250 individual brand case studies, and we will be looking to tie as many of those to monetary outcomes as we possibly can, just to help convince by sheer weight of numbers that we're onto the right thing here.
That would be great. And, you know, it might be easier not to look at profit, which is impacted by all sorts of other things as well, but to look at margins and pricing, which you can look at because pricing is publicly available. Yeah. And that's actually, you know, to the questions earlier in the chat about pricing power, that would get at that. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you. Believe it or not, we've actually already met our time. That really flew by, and we expect many good things to come from your future analyses, and we look forward. So always please reach out to MASB, and we have our summits, we have our webinars for further extension of this and learning. So I just like to, on behalf of MASB, thank you all for participating and bringing this forward. It really is an amazing piece of work. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For listening.
Thank you, everyone.